biggest problem that recruiters and anybody in sales has is that they spend their life asking questions, getting answers, asking questions, getting answers. And the technical term for a process in which you sit somebody else down, you ask them questions and they're expected to answer. The technical term for that is an interrogation, which is no way to build a business relationship. But if you actually watch or listen to the majority of salespeople and recruiters, that's what's actually going on. I mean, I've seen recruiters have a list of questions that they've either been told or they think they've got to get through in sequence. And quite often they'll ask question A and they'll get an answer. And then they ask question B with no connection to what they've just been told by somebody. And that is not a conversation. And the previous 3 sessions that I've done, which is about questioning skills, as in setup, question, response, follow-up. We're now on the follow-up stage. So setup is what comes before the question, and it makes sure that somebody is thinking about the subject in the right way before you try and get an answer off them. Somebody's thinking about the topic, they're thinking about their growth plans, or they're thinking about their career objectives, or what they don't like about their current situation, or what pains they're having in their business, before you ask them a question about that subject. So you get someone to think about the subject, then you ask them to think about the subject. You get them to think about problems they're experiencing before you ask them about problems they're having. Then you get the response, and most people tune out. Most of us are so busy talking or planning the next question, or thinking about, worst of all, thinking about how we're going to make some kind of pitch or sales. I mean, just no. If you've asked somebody a question and they're good enough to give you an answer, for God's sake, shut up, listen, take it all in. If you're on a Zoom call or if you're face to face with somebody, shut up, listen and watch. Because the non-verbals, those non-verbal haptics, they're going to give you at least as much information, probably far more than the simple words. Think of it this way, words are content. The non-verbals, the body language or the tone of voice, they are the context. And content without context doesn't always mean very much. So setup, question, response, follow-up. And the follow-up is where you take all that stuff and turn it into a conversation. Now, let me just explain why this works and where I came across it. I've mentioned a few times, and most of you guys will know, that I spent a lot of time learning neuro-linguistic programming from the guys who invented it, Dr. Richard Bandler and Dr. John Grinder. They were the same guys that taught Tony Robbins how to do his stuff. And the context for most of what they're doing is, most of what they're teaching is therapy of various kinds. They're not teaching you to be a psychotherapist, because Richard Bandler in particular has a habit of taking psychotherapist and explaining it phonetically, which is psycho, the rapist. So it's not a question of learning how to be a psychotherapist. It's a question of learning how to help people in a therapeutic or coaching context. That's how people learn. Certainly I learned neuro-linguistic programming. But the content, it can be taken out of a coaching and out of a therapy context and used to influence anybody in any situation. So I learned about this, what I call follow-up process in neuro-linguistic programming. I learned about this having been in sales professionally for about 15 years, and having had my own sales training business for 5 years. And looking back on it, I wonder what the hell I was doing and how on earth I was making any money and having any success. I did, but I really don't know how. I can only assume that I kissed enough frogs and threw enough brown stuff at the wall and some of it stuck. Because without this follow-up piece, fundamentally, all you're doing is getting enough information to pitch someone something. And I promise you, that is no way to run a railroad. So follow-up, okay? Think about it this way. If you ask someone a question and they're good enough to answer, what are they? They give you opinion, for example. If you give your opinion to somebody, what's the thing that you are least receptive to at that point? What's the thing you want to hear last? What are you least interested in when you've just given somebody your opinion? The thing you're least interested in is their opinion.
Yeah.
What you want to hear is you. You want to hear about you. If I've given you my opinion, I want to hear what you think about my opinion. It's like I've forgotten the source of the quote, but it's that. Oh, I think it was Elizabeth Taylor. That's enough time talking about me. Tell me what. Let's talk about you. What do you think of me? And that's the process that most people are actually doing. They want to hear what you think about what they just said, or they want to talk more about their opinion, their feelings, their history, their past. It's an old cliche that everybody is their own favorite topic. I don't actually believe that, but a lot of people act as though it's true. So if I ask you a question and you answer it, well, two things. If I don't probe into that answer, all I can do is make assumptions. So if I ask you a question, you answer it, I then assume that you mean the same thing that I would if I'd said that. So if you say that you're focusing on driving the business forwards, I have my interpretation of what that means. The chances of it being the same as what you mean are slim to none because you say what you're thinking. But if I'm not careful, I hear what I would think in your situation. That's very rarely the same thing. So, what we're going to do, rather than just hearing it, I'm going to make sure I understand it.
Yeah.
And here's the real secret. By probing in, I'm also going to make sure that you damn well understand it. This came from, as I say, in the therapy context where, if somebody says, oh, I'm feeling a bit down, that doesn't mean anything. It does to them. That's their content. But it doesn't really mean, what does it mean? There's no definition of it. I don't really understand what somebody would mean if they said they were down. Same as I don't understand what somebody means when they say they're looking for an A-list person in this role. Their definition of A-list is based on their experience, their frame of reference, their context, their experience, their skills, their expectations. So the chance of me guessing accurately, non-existent. So what we do instead is probe, we follow up. So ask somebody a question, they give me the answer. And follow up just has two steps to it. The first step is I repeat back what they said. As I mentioned on previous sessions, if I repeat back, I don't mean paraphrasing, by the way. Paraphrasing is just bloody rude. Paraphrasing is taking the words that somebody used and turning them into what they should have said if they were as clever as you. Yeah, that's it's rude, it's insulting. Instead, I parrot phrase. So I literally use their words back to them. So I start out by saying, okay, you said you're looking for an A-list, a top level player, an A-list player in this role. So I replay their words back. If I play your words back to you as a summary, by definition, it will build agreement. It will build consensus. It shows you that I've been listening and I've taken you seriously, which is always good. And at the very least, you're there nodding away with me, which is fabulous. Because if you're nodding away, we're building agreement. And the purpose of influence, as opposed to sales, is that everything should build on an initial agreement, and then just keep building and building and building and building. Simple reason why I don't do a hell of a lot of stuff on objection handling is that if you've not given anybody anything to say no to, what's left? They're going to say yes. So I don't spend a lot of time and effort talking about objection handling, because if we do the influence process right, we don't get a hell of a lot of objections. So the first thing is you say, let's say that we're talking to a client or a prospect and they say, this is a really important role. I need an A-list person in this slot. Okay. You say it's a really important role. You need an A-list player in that slot. I've just replayed it back to them, phrased it back to them. How do you mean? Or in what way? Or could you give me an example? Or what's your definition? Now, there are literally dozens. If you study NLP, this is something called either the meta model or foundation model, but it's the same sort of process. There are literally dozens of different types of questions you can ask. And if you're ever unfortunate enough to buy a book on NLP, you will get entire chapters, thick chapters full of charts and graphs and diagrams and flowcharts. You don't need all that. I've spent the last decade using just those 4 questions. How do you mean? Could you give me an example? What's your definition? In what way? Those are the 4 questions I ask. But because I deliver them with the right tonality, and I'll change the sequence, or I start every question with parrot phrasing back to them. So you said this is a really important role, and you're looking for an A-list player in this slot. This might sound like a slightly weird question. That's an inoculation. Now, if I say to you, this might sound like a slightly odd question, I can ask pretty much anything, and the worst response I'm going to get is, yeah, that is an odd question. But most of the time, it just flies straight past. So I say, okay, really important role. You're looking for an A-list player in this slot. Might sound like a slightly strange question. What's your definition of A-list in this slot? Now, notice, by the way, I didn't say A-list in this vacancy, A-list in this opportunity, A-list in this job. I said slot. And the reason I use slot is because in this example, they use the word slot. Personally, I never would, but this fictional person that I just made up, I hallucinated inside my own head. That's years of NLP for you. They said slot. They said important role. They said A-list player. So that's the language I use back to them. Okay, you say this is a really important role. Slightly naive question, but in what way exactly? In what way is it important? Boom, I'll get an answer. I'm going to get information, and the more information I get, the more I understand, and the more I understand, the easier it is to then fulfill or to position myself as the person that can deliver that for them. And I'm also proving, actually, genuinely, actually taking this person seriously. We're having a conversation. I'm not selling them stuff. Well, actually, yeah, I really, really am. But they're having a conversation with me. We're chatting. I'm just showing interest in them and their opinions and their situation. And the more I express that interest, the more interesting I become. Because the best way to be interesting is to be interested. Yeah. And once you do that consistently, you've got a conversation going. Now, I don't ask all those questions about everything. Yeah, because if somebody says, it's a really important role, and I say, okay, you say it's a really important role, in what way? And they give me an answer, I'm not then going to follow up again with what's your definition and could you give me an example? That's just silly. Yeah. But I could theoretically continue like that until I've got a really clear picture of what's going on. In reality, I don't. In reality, I just get the answer and move on. Okay. Unless it is, I genuinely don't understand, in which case I do it. Now, there's one little pro tip on this. It's a very sophisticated technique that I learned from watching some phenomenal therapists when I was training. And it consists of an enormously complicated body language technique, which I can demonstrate hopefully really quickly. So let's say I'm talking with a candidate, just to change the context a little bit. I'm talking with a candidate and they say, look, I'm getting on a little bit. Amuses me, by the way. People who say I'm getting on a little bit, and they're normally in their late 30s, early 40s. And I'm sat there going, child, what are you talking about, child? Yeah. So I'm getting on a little bit. I need to see some solid progression in my career. Okay. Now, what I will say is, okay, you say, you're getting on a little bit. I don't agree with you, but you say you're getting on a little bit and you need to see some progression. That's my summary. That's my parrot phrasing. And then I will ask the question, well, what's your definition of career progression? Or could you give me an example? Or how do you mean? Or in what way? Those are my 4 questions again. How do you mean? In what way? What's your definition? Could you give me an example? I'll just ask that. but here's how I do it. Okay, you say that you're getting on a bit. I don't agree with you, but you say you're getting on a bit, and you need to see some solid career progression. Here's the technique. How do you mean? In what way? Could you give me an example? What's your definition? I just literally, I do mean this literally, tip my head to one side, change my tone of voice a little bit, and I just become inquisitive, interested, curious. I don't mean curious as in weird. I do that most of the time. In this situation, I literally mean curious, as in curiosity that killed the cat. Tip my head to one side, ask the question. Okay, Steve, I mean, it seems a bit juvenile, seems a bit simplistic. Yeah, it's not. It's really, really not. Watch a really, really good interviewer on YouTube or on the TV. If you watch anybody, if you watch an Emily Mate, there's one end, if you watch a Joe Rogan at the other, they all do the same thing. They just tilt their head slightly to ask a question because it draws people in, it shows interest. If I keep my head straight on, I'm borderline telling you what you ought to think. So I literally do that. If I'm face to face with somebody, if I'm on a Zoom call, I tip my head a little bit. How do you mean? Oh, in what way? Yeah. But Stephen, you can't possibly do it on the head. If you're on a call, yeah, I do. I've got my headset on. I make all my calls on a headset, one way or another. The reason being, just that I make all my calls on a headset so that I can do that. You can't really do this. You can't use your body language when you've got the hand in your ear. It doesn't really work that well. So I try and maximize the opportunity to communicate with somebody, and I'm overselling it now so you can see the point I'm making. So literally, get inquisitive. Demonstrate that you're inquisitive, that you're curious, you're interested. Because if you're interested in them, they might find you interesting. So, how do you mean? Okay. Could you give me an example? Yeah. Let me say, I play back to the, okay, you say you need to make some serious career progression. I just want to make sure I really understand. That's inoculation again. I want to make sure I really understand. How do you mean? Oh well, I need to see some progression into a leadership role. Okay, you say leadership role. What's your definition? Some people might mean leadership role as in leading a team. Some people might mean they want to be a regional director. Some people might want to be a CEO. Whatever. I'm not going to assume that I understand what senior role means. So I tip my head. I ask, what's your definition? Now, please hear the tone of voice here. I'm not saying, what's your definition? I'm saying, what's your definition? I'm curious. I'm interested. I'm not passing any judgment. I'm not telling you what you ought to think or ought to say. I'm just being curious. They'll then give me that information because I've followed up. And at that point, I can either go back in and follow up some more, or I can set up the next question, get an answer, and move through the conversation. Now, let me give you an example here. Have you ever had that situation where you're with your friends and I'm English, so if I'm with my friends and chatting, there's normally some kind of alcohol involved. Actually, not so much these days. I don't do that anymore, but it used to be. But you're having a chat and you're chatting with your friends and you start talking about something, and then 5 minutes later, the conversation's gone somewhere completely unexpected. You don't know how the hell you got there, but it flowed. It just rolled naturally. And, if you start talking about one thing and then 5 minutes later, you're on a completely different topic. You don't know how you got there, but it seemed to make sense at the time. I know I'm not alone in that. Okay. And the way that happened is because of the follow-up. It's because you asked somebody a question or you said something and somebody went, oh, yeah. And then someone followed that up. They took the conversation on and they took it somewhere else. That follow-up and setup is what turns an interrogation into a conversation. And people who do an interrogation, they can make some deals. I think of it this way. There are effectively 3 levels when it comes to influencing people. One-to-one influence. I'm not talking about your marketing and your social media and all this, but one-to-one, there are kind of 3 levels of effectiveness. Entry level is where you're really good at pitching. You're phenomenally good at pitching. You might ask a few questions just to kind of give you an excuse to get into your pitch, but you're a pitcher. Okay? And you throw the ball out and you throw it in there, and some people buy and some people don't. And people who are really good at pitching can have pretty high success rates. God bless. The next level up is people who ask questions and then tailor their pitch based on the questions and answers. And then the top level is what I'm encouraging everybody that's one of my members to get to, is to ask questions and genuinely listen to the answers, and then turn those answers into a conversation that flows and flows and flows. And at that level, you don't need to pitch, because at the end of that conversation, it becomes screamingly obvious that you understand exactly what kind of career progression they want, or exactly what kind of person they want, and how they'll know they found them. And then pitching becomes as simple as summarizing what you've already agreed and agreeing a start date, agreeing the next step forward. So, if you look at all my stuff, I do the minimum I can on pitching. The way I teach pitching is really good. It works like a charm. But in real life, I almost never make a pitch. What I do is set up my questions, ask the questions, listen really hard to what somebody says, and follow up to turn it into a conversation. I go around that little circle, I go around that process until I understand exactly what somebody wants and exactly how they'll know that they've found it. And then I do this little thing called SAQ. I sack them. So once I understand exactly what somebody wants and how they'll know they've found it, I sack them. Okay? And sack is just a simple technique called summarize, advise, and question. Summarize, advise, and question. And you'll find it in other parts of the content. I'm not going to get into it on this call. It will just make it too long. But my pitch in 99% of the situations I find myself in when I'm selling one-to-one is nothing more than summarizing back what we've already agreed in the conversation. I'm not pitching a new idea or a new concept. I don't need to get into the hows and whys and wherefores, because we've already done that through the questions I've asked and the follow-ups I've made. There's no overt pitch. It just kind of seems obvious that we're going to start working together. We just need to agree when and for how much. So it's a very different way of approaching it. Now, if you're selling one-to-many, those rules don't apply as much, because if I'm selling one-to-many, I can't get into question, setup, response, and follow-up, because you just can't do that with a group of people, or online, or through social media, or through a 50-person Zoom call. You just can't. Even if you have sort of prep sessions and things like that, you just can't. So then you're pitching. If you've got an elevator pitch situation, you're pitching, and there's content about pitching separately. But one-to-one, setup, question, response, follow-up. How do you mean? In what way? Could you give me what's your definition? Could you give me an example? That turns pretty much everything into a genuine conversation where both of you are interested and interesting, and you're learning stuff about people. And the additional side benefit, and I'm just about to wind up, the additional side benefit is, if you're genuinely following up and you're genuinely showing interest in somebody, every conversation is a lot more interesting. And you find everything you're doing a hell of a lot less dull and boring, because recruitment is quite a repetitive process. It's iterative. You do the same process over and over again. But this addition of follow-up actually turns each conversation into something much more interesting and much more stimulating and much more fulfilling. So it makes the whole job more interesting, as well as making it a hell of a lot easier to pull in the candidates you want and close the prospects that you want. So aside from that, there's no real benefit to it. Make the job interesting, close more people for better money. Apart from that, there's no real advantage to it. So just a question of pulling those pieces together.